December 1944. When 17-year-old Klaus was captured by American forces, he braced himself for the torture and execution that Nazi propaganda had promised him. But instead, the Americans did something so shocking that it shattered everything he believed about his enemies. They didn't just feed him better than he'd eaten in years. They sent him to school, gave him books, and treated him with a kindness that left him questioning everything he'd been taught about the war. But what could possibly motivate Americans to educate the very soldiers who had been trying to kill them just days before? The winter of 1944 brought death to every corner of Germany. In the bombed-out city of Hamburg, 17-year-old Klaus Weber pressed his face against the cold glass of his family's apartment window. Below him, women and children dug through rubble with bare hands, searching for anything they could burn to stay warm. The smell of smoke and decay drifted up from the streets. Klaus had not eaten a full meal in 3 weeks. His younger brother Hans, barely 16, sat on their thin mattress cleaning his rifle. Both boys wore the brown uniform of the Hitler Youth, though the fabric hung loose on their shrinking frames. Their father had died 2 years ago on the Russian front. Their mother worked 16 hours a day in a munitions factory, her hands stained black from gunpowder. She came home each night more bent and tired than the day before. Klaus remembered when Hamburg had been beautiful. Wide streets lined with shops, families walking together on Sunday afternoons, children playing in parks that now held anti-aircraft guns. That world felt like a dream now. The only reality was hunger, fear, and the constant sound of Allied bombers overhead. Every morning, Klaus and Hans attended Hitler Youth meetings in the basement of what used to be a school. The walls were covered with posters showing strong German soldiers and evil-looking American troops with devil horns. Their leader, Herr Müller, paced back and forth as he spoke. His voice echoed off the concrete walls. "The Americans are animals!" Müller would shout, spit flying from his mouth. "They torture German prisoners. They burn them alive. They feed German children to their dogs." The boys sat in neat rows, nodding along. They had heard these stories since they could walk. Klaus never questioned them. Why would adults lie? Müller showed them photographs of destroyed German cities. "This is what the Americans do," he said, pointing at piles of rubble that used to be homes. "They want to kill every German man, woman, and child. They want to steal our land and make us their slaves." Klaus felt anger burn in his chest. These Americans had killed his father. They had destroyed his city. They had made his mother old before her time. When his turn came to fight, he would show them no mercy. Food became scarcer each week. Klaus's mother brought home turnip soup that was mostly water. Sometimes they found potato peels in the garbage behind restaurants. On good days, they might get a small piece of bread that was more sawdust than grain. Klaus's ribs showed through his skin. His pants needed rope to stay up. The radio brought only bad news. German forces were retreating on all fronts. The Americans and British were pushing deeper into German territory. Russian tanks rolled toward Berlin, but Müller told the boys this was all lies. "German victory is certain," he promised. "Our secret weapons will destroy the enemy." In December, Klaus and Hans received their orders. They would join the final push against American forces in the Ardennes forest. This was their chance to prove themselves as true German warriors. Their mother cried when they left, but she kissed their foreheads and told them to make Germany proud. The train ride west was cold and miserable. Dozens of young soldiers packed into cattle cars with no heat. They shared what little food they had. Klaus noticed how young everyone looked. Most were his age or younger. Some looked like they should still be in school, not heading to war. At night, Klaus could see fires burning on the horizon. The sound of artillery grew louder as they traveled. Hans gripped his rifle tighter. "What if the stories are true?" he whispered to Klaus. "What if the Americans really do torture prisoners?" Klaus put his hand on his brother's shoulder. "Then we die fighting," he said. "Better to die as German heroes than live as American slaves." The Battle of the Bulge began with snow and chaos. Klaus and Hans found themselves in a frozen forest, shooting at enemies they could barely see. The American artillery was louder than anything Klaus had imagined. The ground shook with each explosion. Trees split in half and fell like matchsticks. For 3 days, Klaus ate nothing but snow and a handful of frozen berries. His feet went numb in his thin boots. His hands could barely hold his rifle. Around him, other German soldiers fell one by one. some from bullets, others from cold and hunger. On the fourth day, American soldiers surrounded Klaus and Hans in a small clearing. Klaus raised his rifle, ready to fight to the death, as he had been taught, but his hands were shaking too much to aim. Hans had already dropped his weapon and put his hands up. An American sergeant walked toward them. Klaus expected to see the monster from the Hitler Youth posters. Instead, he saw a tired-looking man about his father's age. The sergeant had kind eyes and spoke broken German. "It's okay, boys," he said softly. "The war is over for you now." Klaus waited for the torture to begin. He waited for the American to pull out a knife or start beating them. Instead, the sergeant gave them each a thick wool blanket and a chocolate bar. Klaus stared at the chocolate. He had not seen real chocolate in 2 years. As American medics checked them for wounds, Klaus felt confused. Where was the cruelty he had been promised? Where were the monsters who ate German children? These soldiers seemed almost normal, even kind. But Klaus pushed these thoughts away. This had to be a trick. The real torture would come later. After all, everything he had been taught his entire life could not be wrong. Could it? The truck ride to Fort McClellan took 2 days. Klaus and Hans sat in the back with 12 other German prisoners. American guards gave them sandwiches with real meat and white bread. Klaus had forgotten what white bread tasted like. The meat was thick and salty. His stomach cramped from eating too much too fast. Hans whispered in German, "Why are they feeding us so well? Are they making us fat before they kill us?" Klaus had no answer. Nothing made sense anymore. The guards even shared their cigarettes and showed pictures of their families back home. When the truck stopped at Fort McClellan in Alabama, Klaus expected to see a death camp. Instead, he saw neat rows of wooden buildings painted white. Gardens grew vegetables between the barracks. German prisoners walked freely around the grounds. Some were playing soccer, others sat in the shade reading books. A camp official named Lieutenant Johnson greeted the new prisoners. He spoke perfect German and smiled when he talked. "Welcome to Fort McClellan," he said. "You will be safe here. You will be fed well, and you will go to school every day." School? Klaus looked at Hans in confusion. This had to be some kind of joke. Why would Americans want to teach German soldiers anything? Their first meal in the camp mess hall shocked Klaus more than anything yet. The room held long wooden tables that could seat 200 men. American cooks served hot beef stew with real chunks of meat. Fresh bread came warm from the ovens. Green beans still had their color. Mashed potatoes were creamy and rich with butter. Klaus ate 3 full bowls. His stomach had shrunk so much that he felt sick afterward. He had not eaten this well since before the war started. Back in Hamburg, his mother would have cried to see such food being thrown away as leftovers. But the biggest shock came after lunch. A guard brought Klaus and Hans each a small paper cup filled with something cold and sweet. "Ice cream," the guard said in English, then in broken German, "Eis." Klaus took a small taste. The vanilla flavor exploded on his tongue. It was sweeter than anything he had ever eaten, cold and smooth and perfect. Hans started crying. "They're going to kill us tomorrow," he sobbed. "This is our last meal. That's why it's so good." But Klaus was not so sure anymore. If the Americans wanted them dead, why waste such expensive food? That evening, more surprises came. A bright red truck pulled up to the camp gates. The words Coca-Cola were painted on the side in white letters. The driver unloaded case after case of brown glass bottles. Guards passed out the cold drinks to any prisoner who wanted one. Klaus opened his bottle and took a sip. The liquid burned his throat in a good way. It was sweet and fizzy, and unlike anything he had tasted. In Germany, they had heard of Coca-Cola, but never seen it. Only rich Americans could afford such luxury. The next morning brought another shock. Instead of being sent to work in mines or factories, Klaus and Hans were led to actual classrooms. Real desks sat in neat rows. Blackboards covered the front walls. Shelves held hundreds of books in both English and German. Their teacher was a German-American man named Mr. Schmidt. He had left Germany 20 years ago and spoke both languages perfectly. "Today we begin your real education," he said. "Not propaganda, not lies, real history, real science, real mathematics." Klaus raised his hand slowly. "Why?" he asked. "Why do you want to teach us anything?" Mr. Schmidt smiled sadly. Because you are not our enemies. You are victims of lies, just like we once were. We want to show you the truth so you can help build a better Germany when you go home. The lessons were nothing like what Klaus had learned in the Hitler Youth. Mr. Schmidt taught them about American democracy. He explained how regular people could vote for their leaders. He showed them maps of the world that looked different from German maps. Countries Klaus thought were tiny were actually huge. Countries he thought were powerful were actually small. In science class, Klaus learned about electricity and chemistry. The teacher let him touch real laboratory equipment, glass beakers and copper wires and scales that could measure tiny amounts. In Germany, such equipment had all gone to the war effort. During lunch that week, Klaus watched American guards playing baseball with German prisoners. The guards laughed when prisoners made mistakes. They cheered when someone hit the ball well. Klaus could not understand this kindness. Why were enemies being so nice to each other? One afternoon, a guard named Sergeant Williams sat next to Klaus during dinner. Williams pulled out photographs of his wife and 2 young daughters. "My oldest is about your age," he said in simple English. "She wants to be a teacher like you're learning to be." Klaus stared at the pictures. The American girl looked happy and healthy. She was smiling in a school uniform. "Your daughter goes to school?" Klaus asked in broken English. "Of course," Williams laughed. "All American children go to school. Boys and girls, rich and poor, everyone gets to learn." Klaus felt his world tilting again. In Germany, only certain children could go to good schools. Only boys could study science. Only the wealthy could afford books. That night, Klaus lay in his clean bed with real sheets and a warm blanket. Through the window, he could see lights from the American town nearby. Cars drove past with their headlights on. People walked on sidewalks without fear of bombs. Hans whispered from the next bed, "Klaus, what if everything they told us was wrong? What if Americans aren't monsters?" Klaus had been thinking the same thing. Every day brought new evidence that nothing he had learned was true. Americans had more food than they could eat. They treated prisoners better than Germans treated their own people. They wanted to educate their enemies instead of destroying them. But admitting this meant admitting that everything Klaus believed was a lie. It meant his father had died for nothing. It meant the suffering in Germany was not noble sacrifice, but terrible waste. Klaus closed his eyes and tried to push these dangerous thoughts away. But deep down, he knew the truth was already changing him in ways he could not stop. Christmas Eve, 1944 arrived with snow falling softly on Fort McClellan. Klaus had been a prisoner for 3 weeks now. Each day had brought new lessons that made his old world seem like a bad dream. But tonight would change everything he thought he knew about himself and his enemies. The mess hall had been decorated with green pine branches and red ribbons. American guards had spent all afternoon setting up long tables with white tablecloths. The smell of roasting turkey filled the air. Klaus had never smelled anything so good in his entire life. Lieutenant Johnson stood at the front of the room as prisoners filed in. "Tonight we celebrate Christmas together," he announced in German. "American and German, enemy and friend. We are all human beings on this holy night." Klaus sat next to Hans at a table near the back. They watched in amazement as American cooks brought out plate after plate of food. Roasted turkey with crispy brown skin, sweet potatoes covered in melted butter, green bean casserole with crunchy onions on top, fresh bread rolls that were still warm from the oven. But then something happened that made Klaus's throat tighten with emotion. The camp chaplain, an elderly man with kind eyes, began to sing in perfect German. O Tannenbaum, wie treu sind deine Blätter." The familiar Christmas carol echoed through the hall. One by one, the German prisoners began to sing along. Their voices mixed together in harmony they had not felt since leaving home. Klaus felt tears running down his cheeks. These were the same songs his mother had sung to him as a child. The same words his father had hummed while decorating their Christmas tree years ago. When the song ended, Sergeant Williams stood up. He held a small wrapped package in his hands. "This is from my daughter Sarah," he said in simple German. "She wanted me to give this to a German boy her age." Williams walked over and placed the gift in front of Klaus. Klaus's hands shook as he unwrapped the brown paper. Inside was a small wooden cross carved by hand. A note was attached in careful English handwriting. "For my new German friend, I hope you can go home to your family soon. Merry Christmas, Sarah Williams." age 16. Klaus stared at the cross and the note. This American girl, whose father was guarding German prisoners, had spent her own money and time to make a gift for an enemy soldier. She had called him her friend. She wanted him to go home safely to his family. Hans leaned over and whispered, "Klaus, I don't understand. Why would she do this? We're supposed to be her enemies." Klaus could not answer. His whole world was cracking apart like ice in spring. Everything he had been taught was proving false. Americans were not monsters who ate children. They were people with families and feelings, just like Germans. They celebrated the same Christmas. They sang the same songs. They wanted the same things: peace, safety, love. That night, Klaus lay in bed holding Sarah's wooden cross. He pulled out a small notebook that Mr. Schmidt had given him for writing practice. By the light of the moon through his window, he began to write his thoughts in German. December 24th, 1944. Today I learned that everything I believed was a lie. The Americans are not savage beasts. They are kind people who treat their enemies better than our own leaders treated us. They feed us food that German children have never tasted. They teach us knowledge that German schools never shared. They give us gifts and call us friends. Klaus paused, his pencil hovering over the paper. Writing these words felt dangerous, like admitting a terrible secret. But he had to get the thoughts out of his head before they drove him crazy. I think about my mother working in the factory with her black-stained hands. I think about the children in Hamburg digging through rubble for food. I think about my father dying in Russia for leaders who lied to us. The Americans have enough food to feed all of Germany. They have medicine to heal our sick. They have schools to teach our children. Yet we were told they wanted to destroy us. The next morning brought more revelations. In history class, Mr. Schmidt showed them photographs of America that German newspapers had never printed. Cities with no bomb damage, children playing in parks, families having picnics by lakes, women going to college, black and white students sitting in the same classrooms. This is the real America, Mr. Schmidt explained. A country where people of all backgrounds can build better lives, where children learn to think for themselves instead of just obeying orders, where questions are welcomed instead of punished. Klaus raised his hand. But why did Germany start this war if America was so peaceful? Mr. Schmidt's face grew sad. Because your leaders wanted power more than they wanted peace. They told you lies about America so you would be willing to fight. They made you afraid so you would do anything they asked. That afternoon, Klaus watched American soldiers teaching German prisoners how to play basketball. The Americans cheered when Germans made good shots. They high-fived their former enemies when they learned new skills. Klaus saw Sergeant Williams laughing with a German prisoner who was old enough to be his father. "How can they be so kind to us?" Hans asked. "We tried to kill them just a month ago." Klaus thought about this question for a long time. Finally, he understood. "Because they know we were lied to," he said. "They know we were just boys following orders from evil men. They see us as victims, not enemies." This realization hit Klaus like a physical blow. He was not a German hero fighting for his homeland. He was a victim of men who had used children as weapons. His father had not died gloriously for Germany. He had died uselessly for leaders who cared nothing about German people. Klaus felt anger burning in his chest, but not at Americans anymore. He was angry at Hitler. At the Nazi Party, at every adult who had filled children's heads with hate and lies. They had stolen Klaus's childhood and sent him to die for their greed and power. That evening, Klaus wrote in his notebook again, "I see America clearly now, not through the lens of propaganda, but with my own eyes. They could have treated us like animals, but they chose to treat us like human beings. They could have filled us with more hate, but they chose to teach us truth. They didn't just capture our bodies, they freed our minds." Klaus looked around the warm, well-lit barracks where he and Hans slept safely each night. Tomorrow would bring more lessons, more kindness, more proof that everything he had believed was wrong. But tonight, for the first time since leaving Germany, Klaus felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. May 1946 brought Klaus home to a Germany he barely recognized. The train from the port city of Bremen wheezed and coughed as it carried former prisoners back to their families. Klaus pressed his face against the dirty window and watched his homeland pass by in ruins. Entire cities looked like broken teeth. Bridges hung twisted over empty rivers. Fields that should have been green with spring crops lay brown and empty. Klaus carried everything he owned in a small canvas bag. Inside were his notebooks from American classes, Sarah Williams's wooden cross, and a letter of recommendation from Lieutenant Johnson. But the most important things he carried could not be touched. English words filled his mind. Democratic ideas changed how he saw the world. Questions burned in his thoughts that would never be answered the old way. The train station in Hamburg was a pile of twisted metal and broken concrete. Klaus walked through streets he had known since childhood. But everything looked different now, not just because of the bomb damage, but because Klaus himself had changed. Houses that had seemed normal before now looked small and cramped. Streets that had felt wide now seemed narrow. The whole city felt like it was holding its breath. Hans had gotten off the train in Munich to find his aunt. The brothers had hugged goodbye, both knowing they were different people than the boys who had left Germany 18 months ago. "Remember what we learned," Klaus had whispered to his brother. "Remember the truth." Klaus found his family's apartment building still standing, though most of the windows were boarded up with wood. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs, his heart pounding with each step. What would his mother think of him? Would she be angry that he had learned to love his enemies? His mother opened the door and gasped. Klaus stood 6 inches taller than when he had left. His shoulders were broad from American food and exercise. His skin was healthy and clean. Most shocking of all, he smiled when he saw her. She had not seen anyone smile in Hamburg for 2 years. "Klaus?" she whispered, as if afraid he might disappear. "Is it really you?" "Yes, Mama," he said in German, then added in English, "I'm home." She threw her arms around him and sobbed. Klaus felt how thin she had become. Her hair was completely gray now. Her hands were still stained black from factory work, but the factory had closed months ago. She had been living on soup made from weeds and potato peels. That first evening, Klaus unpacked the small care package that Sergeant Williams had given him. Canned meat, chocolate bars, white bread, and powdered milk. His mother stared at the food like it was treasure. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "From the Americans who captured me," Klaus said quietly. "They wanted to make sure you had something to eat." His mother's face twisted with confusion. "The Americans gave you food for me?" "But they are our enemies." Klaus sat down beside her on their thin mattress. "Mama, I need to tell you what I learned. The Americans are not our enemies. They never were. We were lied to about everything." Over the next hour, Klaus told his mother about Fort McClellan, about the school classes and the kind teachers, about ice cream and Coca-Cola and basketball games, about Christmas dinner and Sarah Williams' gift, about learning that Americans wanted to help Germany rebuild, not destroy it. His mother listened with tears in her eyes. "You mean your father died for nothing?" she whispered. Klaus took her hands in his. "Papa died because bad men told him lies, but his death was not meaningless if we learn from it, if we make sure it never happens again." Within a week, Klaus had found work with the American occupation forces as a translator. His English was perfect after 18 months of practice. But more importantly, he understood both cultures. He could help Americans and Germans work together to rebuild the country. Klaus used his first paycheck to buy real food for his mother: white bread, fresh eggs, milk, and meat. She cried when she tasted butter for the first time in 3 years. "The Americans pay you this much just to help them talk to German people?" she asked. "They pay me to help build a new Germany," Klaus explained. "A Germany where children learn to think instead of just obey. Where people choose their leaders instead of being ruled by dictators. Where we solve problems with words instead of war." Months passed, and Klaus watched his city slowly come back to life. American engineers helped rebuild bridges. American doctors treated sick children. American teachers helped start new schools. The same people Klaus had been taught to hate were now helping Germany become stronger than ever. Klaus began teaching English to other young Germans. In the evenings, he would read from his American notebooks and tell stories about life at Fort McClellan. Many listeners were angry at first. They did not want to hear good things about their former enemies. But gradually, Klaus's words began to change minds. One evening, a young German girl raised her hand during Klaus's English class. "Herr Weber," she said, "why did the Americans help us when we fought against them?" Klaus smiled and pulled out Sarah Williams' wooden cross, which he still carried every day. because they know that enemies can become friends, because they believe that education is stronger than hate, because they understand that the best way to win a war is to win the peace that comes after. Years later, Claus would become a teacher himself. He would help write textbooks for the new democratic Germany. He would bring American exchange students to meet German families. He would spend his life building bridges between the two countries. But, on quiet evenings, Claus would still take out his notebooks from Fort McClellan and read his own words. They didn't just capture our bodies, they freed our minds. The Americans had done something that no conquering army in history had ever tried. Instead of seeking revenge against their enemies, they had chosen to educate them. Instead of destroying the next generation of Germans, they had invested in making them better. Claus learned that the greatest victory was not defeating your enemy on the battlefield. The greatest victory was turning your enemy into a friend. The Americans had won not just the war, but the peace that followed. They had shown that kindness was stronger than cruelty, that truth was more powerful than lies, and that education could heal even the deepest wounds of hatred. In the end, Claus realized the Americans had given him the most precious gift of all, the ability to think for himself. And that gift would shape not just his life, but the future of his entire country.